So throughout our discussions of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, keep this question in mind. When it comes to our beliefs, how often do we close our minds to evidence and arguments, especially when the evidence and the arguments seem to contradict our core beliefs? Also, we need to make sure that we focus on the symbolism of the allegory and not get bogged down in the literal details. So we always want to be interpreting what the events of the allegory signify about real people, not fictional cave dwellers. For instance, the prisoner's body symbolizes our soul or mind, ancient Greek psyche, meaning soul, mind, or intellect. All right, so let's look at the background of the Allegory of the Cave. The text was written by the philosopher Plato around 380 BC. Right, so that's about 20 years after the execution of his teacher, Socrates. Socrates was sentenced to death by the Athenians when he was 70 years old, having been convicted of the crime of impiety. Now, the allegory appears in Book 7 of Plato's The Republic. The Republic is probably the most influential work of political philosophy ever produced. And like all of Plato's works, The Republic is a dialogue. It's a fictional conversation between Socrates and his companions concerning some philosophical topic. Right? We call these the Platonic dialogues. And Socrates is the central character in nearly all of Plato's dialogues. Plato sort of uses Socrates as a vehicle for exploring his own ideas. Now, the Republic is Plato's attempt to define the essence of justice, examining such questions as, how does the just person live their life? Should we act justly even if we could act unjustly and never be found out? Does the just person live a happier life than the unjust person? Now, in the text, Socrates recognizes that defining justice is just impossibly difficult. The nature of justice is obscure. It's difficult to see its nature properly, Socrates says. So let's magnify justice. Well, imagine what the perfectly good and just city looks like first, and once we perceive what justice looks like for this state, having seen it on a magnified scale, then we'll better know what justice looks like for the individual. So over 10 long books of the Republic, Plato constructs the perfectly just city, the nourishing environment, which truly promotes eudaimonia, right? Human well-being, human flourishing, human excellence. In other words, the Republic imagines a utopian society. Now, obviously, if one is imagining how the perfect society would be arranged and organized, they'll have to address the questions of social or public education, right? What would the purpose of education be in a perfect society? How would the perfect society promote education among the people? What would the youth learn, and how would they be taught? But also, what the hell does it mean to receive an education anyway, right? And so this is when Socrates introduces the Allegory of the Cave. The Allegory of the Cave is Plato's formulation of a philosophy of education. Now, the allegory occurs in Book 7 of 10 books of the Republic, right? So we're already 3/4 of the way through the Republic when the Allegory of the Cave appears. But we really don't have to know much of anything about the rest of the dialogue in order to get a whole lot out of the allegory. And lastly, the Allegory of the Cave is probably the most famous single passage in the history of recorded philosophy. Okay, so this is an allegory, but what is an allegory? Well, an allegory is a symbolic story, right? What makes a story allegorical is that fictional characters and events represent something real. For example, consider the Chronicles of Narnia, right? The lion, Aslan, represents Jesus. Likewise, for the Allegory of the Cave, Plato thinks that there is some corresponding reality that these fictional characters and events are meant to symbolize or represent. All right, so let's get into the text first by exploring and examining the setting of the allegory. So the text begins with Socrates describing an image to Glaucon. This very strange image, as Glaucon puts it. Right? We've got these cave dwellers, bound by chains since they were children. And they're bound in such a way that they can't turn around or even move their heads. They can only look at what's immediately in front of them. And so they're looking at glimmering shadows that are cast on the wall facing them. And behind them is this low wall, like the screen that puppeteers use. People walk behind that wall carrying sculptures, right? Trees, animals, houses, every manner of thing and object. And a fire at the back of the cave projects shadows of these sculptures onto the wall in front of the prisoners. Later, we find out that these kind of puppeteers are also making sounds. They're talking with one another and making noises that are appropriate to the objects that they carry. And because of an echo effect in the cave, the sound appears to come from the shadows themselves. So the cave is like this perfect simulation of reality, but it's not really reality. Lastly, behind and above all of this, there's the mouth of the cave and an exit to actual reality where there are real trees and real animals and real things. Okay, so hearing Socrates describe all of this, Glaucon says, well, man, that's a really strange, like a horrifyingly strange image that you've shown me, Socrates, and really strange, wretched sort of prisoners. And then Socrates says something in response that I hope you found a little bit disturbing, right? Who are these prisoners? What does Socrates say? He says, but they are just like us, Glaucon. So the prisoners symbolize human beings, and the cave is the human condition. You are, Plato says, a prisoner in a cave, looking only at the shadows of things. And they're not even shadows of real things, but the shadows of copies of real things. Okay, so how do the prisoners spend their time imagining they could talk to one another? Well, on page 3, Socrates says, if they were able to discuss things with one another, would they not assume that the shadows were real things, and wouldn't they give names to the shadows, taking them to be real? Right? The prisoners are naming the shadows, and this is really significant. I mean, what's going on here? Because it's not just a sort of game they're playing to pass the time. Right? When you name something, what you're doing is identifying what it is. And so as an example, my brother, he's got 2 kids, my nephews. And when they were about 2 years old, something kind of new and crazy happened. Language theorists call it the language development explosion phase. And so suddenly my nephews, they're naming stuff all over the place. Kitty, apple, TV, poop, whatever it happens to be, right? And it's never just a silly game, right? They are learning to make sense of their world using language, right? Logos, to structure and organize their experience of the world. And so it's the same that's going on here for the prisoners, right? The cave dwellers are coming to intelligently apprehend an intelligible world. The prisoners name the things that come before them because human beings have a natural desire to understand, to make sense of the world in which we find ourselves. Of course, the trouble is, that's not a tree, right? It's a shadow, and it's not even a shadow of a real tree, but a shadow of a copy of a real tree, right? The prisoners are many times removed from the real things that properly deserve the names that they have. Right, on page 4, Socrates says, such men as these would hold that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of artificial things. Of course, the cave dwellers, right, these prisoners are none the wiser. Again, they aren't just ignorant. They are ignorant of their ignorance, right? This is the world they found themselves in. They've been adjusted to it. They don't know anything different. They don't experience their condition as one of imprisonment. They believe they are free. All right, and so what does Socrates ask us to imagine next? Well, that a prisoner gets released. We're not really told why, and it's not too important. But, what's it like when the prisoner gets released from his chains? Right, if we read here in the middle of page 4, Socrates says, "Now, let's imagine what would naturally follow if such men were released from their bondage and cured from their delusions. For instance, say one man is let loose and compelled suddenly to stand, turn his neck around, and then escorted toward the fire. Certainly all of these actions would cause much pain, and the glow from the fire would itself be quite intense, dazzling and disorienting him. He would be too distressed to see properly the objects of which he used to see only the shadows." And so look again at this first paragraph, right? The prisoner is set free, but then he is compelled suddenly to stand, right? His liberator has to compel him, has to force him to stand up and turn around, right? We get the idea that his chains are broken, but he just keeps sitting there. There's no exuberance at being released. He doesn't know he's being liberated, again, because he never realized that he was a prisoner in the first place. I mean, think about that. He doesn't know that, quote, turning around is even a possibility. And so symbolically, what can this mean? What does it mean that the soul, right, the mind, doesn't know how to turn around? Something here is holding the mind hostage, but it's such that we don't even realize that we are in that hostage situation to begin with, right? So the prisoner is disoriented and he's in pain from moving his body for the first time, right? He's never moved it before in all these years. The glow from the fire, it hurts his eyes and disorients his vision. It's like leaving the movies in the middle of the day, right? Because your eyes have adjusted to darkness, it's disorienting when you exit the theater into bright daylight. So that's what's happening to our prisoner. He's in pain, he's shocked, he's agitated, he's disoriented. And then the liberator begins to test him. He's like, look, name these things, these sculptures, right? You have the concepts, don't you? And these sculptures are more real than those things you were seeing and naming before. What I'm showing you is nearer to reality, nearer to the truth. But can the prisoner correctly identify and name the sculptures? Of course not, right? He can barely see the objects at all. Remember, he's also never seen color before. He's never even encountered three-dimensional objects. He's only seen shadows, colorless, one-dimensional, simple images, always glimmering, always changing. All right, he can't name the sculptures when he's being tested and asked to do so because he doesn't really know what he's looking at. Symbolically, right, his logos, his use of reason and language is going haywire. And so confused and in pain, the prisoner wants to shut his eyes to all of this disorienting visual input. And so again, what does this represent? Right? Symbolically, it represents a person wanting to close their mind. And again, all of this has to do with a process of education, authentic education. All right, so what does our prisoner want to do, right? At this point, he wants to return to the shadows at the base of the cave, right? It's a world that he knows. It's safe. It's comfortable. He's not in pain down there, certainly. And it's a part of the world where his common sense, unexamined beliefs are confirmed, validated, and reinforced by the fellow prisoners who share his view of the world, right? Quite literally, they share the same view of the world. Now, throughout Plato's allegory, objects of perception come to symbolize objects of knowledge. And so each phase of the story revolves around different sorts of visual objects that the prisoner struggles to look at. And again, those visual objects represent objects of knowledge. Things seen are always representing or symbolizing things that are known or believed to be known. Right? So the first sort of visual objects or objects of perception are the shadows, then the sculptures, then all the different things outside of the cave. Right? And all of these different objects of perception are going to function as important symbols. All right, so what do the shadows represent? Well, the shadows symbolize passively accepted core beliefs. What do I mean by that? Well, as we grow up, and even as we're full adults, we come to passively accept many beliefs. In other words, we haven't actively examined the reasons for holding those beliefs or whether or not they're good reasons. Nonetheless, it's normal and inevitable that we passively inherit very many beliefs and outlooks. Yet, these are beliefs that shape our identities before we can critically examine them. And we are often held hostage by these passively accepted core beliefs precisely because it's painful to examine them. Yet examining our passively accepted core beliefs, being ready to alter or abandon them, is absolutely necessary for intellectual and personal growth. And it is the kind of fundamental dynamic of education, this willingness to alter and examine our core beliefs that have actually helped structure our very identities. Right? Those are the shadows. Now let's consider the sculptures. When the prisoner looks at the sculptures for the first time, he can't make them out and doesn't actually believe that they are truer than the shadows, and he wants to close his eyes. Okay, so then what do the sculptures represent? What do they symbolize? The sculptures represent arguments or other worldviews that challenge or contradict our core beliefs, right? They're like arguments that we've never encountered before. But perhaps even more importantly, the sculptures symbolize arguments that have more detail and sophistication than our simplistic, previously held, passively accepted beliefs. And the fire that illuminates the sculptures physically, right, it hurts the prisoner's eyes. And this visual pain represents a psychological pain. The sculptures, therefore, represent those arguments that are psychologically threatening and make us want to close our mind, right? To close our mind to information that challenges our beliefs and thus our identity, that causes a certain degree of anxiety and discomfort. And so you want to think about whether or not you've ever had such an experience, right? Experiencing a sort of psychological discomfort or anxiety when your common sense core beliefs get challenged. And think about, like, what are the topics where we find our core beliefs being challenged in ways that unsettle us, right? Because it doesn't really have to do with like our favorite TV shows or our favorite food, things that are, relatively trivial, right? But rather it's topics in like politics or topics about, let's say, race and racism in America, or topics of religion and religious truth, or even scientific knowledge, or topics of patriotism and protest and capitalism versus socialism, gender, feminism, oppression, exploitation, social justice, etc. Those are the topics about which we have lots of core beliefs, more often than not, passively held beliefs, and it can create anxiety when these things are questioned. Now, the prisoner probably thinks that he's being manipulated at this point, right? When in fact he's actually being liberated, right? It would make sense for him to be suspicious of this person who's now functioning as a teacher, right? Look, you're showing me all these strange objects. You're calling them more true than what I believe. You're trying to turn me against common sense. You're trying to turn me against what I already know to be true. But whether or not this prisoner accepts the sculptures as more real, that is, whether or not he accepts that the sculptures are better candidates for his collection of concepts and names, something has definitely been revealed to the prisoner. He has become aware of his ignorance, because this is his first encounter with three-dimensional objects of clarity and color and detail. Deep down, whether he wants to admit it to himself or not, the prisoner probably knows that his knowledge of what's actually the case is very, very limited. And that sort of revelation, when it's about certain topics, can cause an intellectual crisis. But Plato believes that this crisis is a very good thing This is where education begins. So the prisoner, he wants to flee back to his spot in the cave, but he isn't allowed to, right? What happens next? Well, Plato says he's dragged to the mouth of the cave. And suppose next that his liberator dragged him by force away from the fire, dragged him right up to the mouth of the cave, and held him directly into the coming sunlight, right? So finally, our prisoner here at the mouth of the cave, hardly a voluntary participant, and then he's held into the sunlight. You can imagine the liberator yelling at him, look at it, look at the light, and the prisoner just kind of screaming in pain and discomfort. Again, this is supposed to be what education is for Plato, authentic education. And so he's beyond irritated, beyond aggravated. This is traumatizing for him. The sunbeams filling his eyes for the first time. Our prisoner is essentially blind at this point. In fact, if the prisoner is going to be brave enough to explore his new surroundings, right, he must grow very accustomed to confusion, disorientation, and discomfort. Those are going to be some of the prerequisite sort of virtues, right? A willingness to tolerate confusion, disorientation, and discomfort, the prerequisite virtues for being able to engage in education. Again, and so why is that the case? What's the symbolic meaning of all of this? Well, critical thinking and education is characterized, especially at first, by mental confusion and pain, right? Critical thinking requires that we become willing and able to question our beliefs and, if necessary, alter or abandon them entirely, to take the initiative ourselves to examine what we believe and why. This is the beginning of intellectual liberation and growth, right? No one can bring light down into the cave. The prisoner must have the desire to leave the cave. All right, so then once he's outside, he gradually adjusts to light outside of the cave, and it's a prolonged period of adjustment. He can't see everything he wants to right away. And this is a process that, again, involves different sorts of visual objects, different sorts of objects of perception. At first, he can only look at the shadows of things. It's what he knows how to make sense of, right? Because that's what he saw down in the cave. But, they're images without any real detail or complexity, kind of like simple, quote, black and white views of the world. Next, in this process of adjustment outside of the cave, the next thing he can look at are reflections of things in the water, right? He begins to grow used to the detail and the complexity that color adds to objects of perception, right? Again, this now symbolizes more sophisticated and complex views or arguments about the world. Next, he can finally look upon the things themselves. So he's no longer looking at one-dimensional images, but now he's looking at three-dimensional objects along with color, right? So he can pick up the object and turn it around and gain multiple perspectives on the same object, right? So what does this symbolize? This object of perception, it symbolizes even more complex arguments because it takes much longer to investigate, process, and comprehend complex ideas and complex theories. Next, he gazes upon the night sky, right? The beautiful and incomprehensible things in the heavens. But he can only look up at the sky at night, right? As the sun is still far too bright. And this object of perception, it symbolizes kind of deep metaphysical truths about the nature of reality and existence. And finally, at last, the prisoner can gaze upon the sun itself. And he begins to understand that the sun provides light, which is necessary for any object of perception to be seen at all. And so the sun kind of represents the source of truth. So having understood that the sun is the source of all light, which is necessary for anything to be seen, the freed prisoner has now become enlightened. And outside the cave, now with his sight fully restored, and now that he's enlightened, he feels pity for his former comrades down in the base of the cave. I mean, nothing would make him want to live as they live, believe what they believe, and desire what they desire. But nonetheless, he returns to the cave to tell his former friends the truth about the light and set them free. All right, and so what's this process like for a freed prisoner? You know, we can imagine what he would say upon his return. Listen, everyone, your whole life is a lie. Nothing you believe is really true. Come with me, right? You're prisoners here, but you don't actually know it. You have the beliefs and the desires of prisoners. But me, right? I've seen the truth. I've seen the light. Follow me. Now, of course, all of the prisoners who are still chained up, they're really suspicious of this guy. They're sort of like, okay, genius, let's see how wise you really are. And they hold this competition, right? A sort of shadow naming competition, a sort of cave dwellers jeopardy, right? Who can identify the most shadows? Who can best predict their order? And how does our liberated cave dweller do in this shadow naming competition? He does absolutely terrible, right? He loses. And he's having the opposite problem from before. Now he's blind again. He's blind from coming out of the light and going into the darkness. And it's going to take a process of adjustment for him to be able to see in the deep, dark cave. All right? There hasn't been enough time yet for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. And so he makes a fool out of himself in this competition. And so the prisoners, right, they would laugh and say, oh, well, up he went with his eyes, but down he came without them. But what's important is that he isn't just an object of ridicule, right? His former comrades, they think that this guy is truly dangerous. And why? Why is he seen as dangerous? Well, he's marching down here, upsetting everyone's conventional beliefs, accusing them of being prisoners, of not knowing what true sight is. But he's the one who appears blind. And so they say, look, if we listen to this guy, we're going to go blind too. And so if anyone else tries to pull what he's pulled, we're going to catch him and we're going to kill him. And so the stakes are quite high. All right. Well, so that's where we'll end lecture 1. The second lecture video and the second lecture notes, right, they'll discuss in more detail a lot of the different symbolism in the allegory of the cave. So stay tuned for that.